So welcome everybody. Really excited to talk to you today about governance in a time of crisis. So when I talk about governance, I'm not only speaking as a consultant, but I'm also speaking as a volunteer myself. I've been on several boards over the years and have had the privilege of being chair of a couple of those boards. And so this gives me a perspective, a unique perspective on leadership and governance based on real experiences. And my own boards have been put to the test in the last few weeks. So a lot of what I'll be sharing with you today are some lessons learned, and hopefully you'll find them helpful as you move forward and navigate through this crisis. We need to remember that our volunteers with the utmost responsibility are our board members, and during a time of crisis, they can be our greatest ally or our worst enemy. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some tips today on how to keep everything going smoothly in the right direction. So crisis is the ultimate test of strength, and I'm sure you've been feeling lately, if you're at the head of an organization or a board, that you've truly been put to the test in the last month or so. And right now, what I'm seeing is that our clients who have good governance are managing pretty well. They are less stressed than those who have poor governance. So there's really a very clear line differentiating the two. And that's why I felt that this topic was super important to share. And based on the responses that we got from you in the poll that we did after our first webinar, this was a hot topic for many. So as you know, the reputation, the skills, and the commitment and judgment of the board of directors are crucial in a time of crisis. And let's start by defining a crisis. What is an actual crisis, right? So it's a risk that threatens to substantially disrupt, damage, or destroy an organization's operations, business, or reputation. And right now, we're all in the same boat. The unique quality of the COVID crisis is that we're all in it together. We're all being affected by this. It isn't one singular thing that's happening to one singular organization. It's happening to all of us. So this is quite a unique thing to be living together, and hopefully we can learn from each other as well. So what's the role of a board? Well, a board should be making sure that the organization has a risk management program in place, that the management team is active and reactive and open to identifying and managing risk. That's one of their first responsibilities. If the organization already has a formal crisis management system in place or a plan in place, then generally the executive director should handle the immediate needs, and the board members should provide guidance and support to the management team, and support the communication strategy, see where they can be useful. It can be a challenge because most directors will be predisposed to wanting to fix everything and address the crisis head on. But we really, board members need to remember that they should only really get involved where they're most needed. And managing that can be a little tricky at times. Hopefully we'll be able to give you some tips today. So in terms of communications, according to a recent blog post by Board Source, not only should the board be thinking about the effects of COVID-19 on the planning for potential risks, it needs to consider what and how the organization will communicate with the staff, with leaders of the community and the community it serves, its beneficiaries. A good starting point for a crisis communications plan is to have a frank discussion between the executive director and the board centered on these questions. So what exactly should we be sharing with our public? What are who's going to be the main point of contact for communications? So this can either be somebody who's appointed within the staff who is knowledgeable on the subject, or it can also be a volunteer like a board member who can be your spokesperson. When I'm using the term spokesperson throughout this presentation today, I'm not talking about like a porte-parole, a famous star spokesperson in that sense. I'm saying someone who's responsible for carrying the message of the organization. You should also be looking at, whether you need to create a mini task force that's going to focus solely on the crisis so that everybody else can try and keep going as best as they can with their usual responsibilities, if that's possible to maintain. And also, who's in charge of what during the crisis, because you will have to recognize that certain responsibilities are going to have to set aside to manage the crisis as to not burn out your most valuable resources, your team and your staff, right? So once it hits, what do we do? There are 5 things to keep in mind, and this list was inspired by a report called "The Board Role in Crisis Management" by the law firm Osler. And number 1 is identifying the problem. Well, with COVID, we understand what the real problem is, right? And it's been defined as a pandemic, and we just need to understand that a crisis can be on many levels. And I want you to take this advice and these tips into the future so that whatever crisis happens in your organization, that you'll feel prepared for it, just as well as hopefully these tips will help you get through this one. But a crisis can be of your reputation, it could be mismanagement, it could be fraud, it could be a number of things that's keeping you from delivering on your mission that may lead to lawsuits, so it's important to understand and take the time to identify what's at the core of the problem and identify the issue as quickly as possible. Identifying the effects of the problem on the organization. This is where it's key to keep your board informed at all times. That you need to report to your board regularly, even more regularly than you normally would. It helps to include the boards in the decision-making process, which can support the executive director and the staff. So be sure to be looping them in on a regular basis. Understanding the risks and potential consequences. Well, I mean, in COVID, is it a question of, your organization's challenges are financial? Is it a disruption of service? What is it that is the biggest problem? There can be a number of different implications that can arise, and you need to write them all down and prioritize them as best you can. In terms of asking for help, this is where your volunteers are key in a time of crisis. The board and the extended volunteer network can be a huge asset to your organization. And you can have, volunteers that are skilled in communications to help you write, certain communiques to your stakeholders. If you have, if you have to revisit your finances, let's get your treasurer involved. If it's a question of, fundraising and donor management and stakeholder management, maybe you have volunteers on your board who are, seasoned in philanthropy that can help coach you there. So, just try to reach out and use those resources as best you can. Investigate and acting and reporting. No matter how bad it gets, you need to keep all the stakeholders engaged and informed. And there's so much misinformation circulating on the web right now. People can jump to conclusions. You really have to get your communications in order so that you can reassure your donors that your organization is going to get through this, and that you need them to be there for you through thick and thin. So it's best to take action. And if you sit back and if you're too quiet for too long, you will be forgotten. And so you need to keep those lines of communications open. What to discuss when you sit down with your board and your leadership team. First and foremost, talk about your team. How does this crisis affect your team? If you can't get your team in order and protected from the crisis, you're not going to be able to move forward without your team. So that's top of the list. Then you need to look at how it's going to affect your beneficiaries, donors, funders. What are their budgets looking like? Do we have to rerun the numbers with the new reality if we've had to cancel events, if we've had to shift things around? These are all things that have to be looked at. And then within your partnerships in your community, if you are cutting back on your services because you can't deliver, how does that affect the community at large? And then, is there a way to operate during the crisis? How are we going to recover? And what do we do if this ever happens again? And again, a crisis may not come in this form of a pandemic. It could be any of the other crisis situations that I listed earlier, but you need to be prepared. So that's why getting a plan together is quite key. Sorry, skipping ahead. And so what should a plan include? Well, this is where your board can also come in handy and participate in helping management develop and document a crisis management plan that meets the board's approval. And the key components of the plan should include financial review, having a media strategy, looking at the logistics for convening emergency board meetings. So, our organization tends to meet 6 or 7 times a year. You have to look at whether you have to increase that to every few weeks if during the time of a crisis, and make sure that your board members are aware that you need them to be available more than normal, and agree on a schedule that can suit their schedules, because they're also going through their own crisis management, either through professional or personal situations of their own. So you need to keep that in mind as well. Reviewing policy statements. Are there things that you have in place? For example, on yesterday's webinar, somebody brought up the fact of having an AGM. They want to convert their AGM to a virtual AGM, and would it be legally binding, the things that would get voted on during a virtual AGM. So if you don't have it in your bylaws that you're allowed to do virtual AGMs, then you might want to consider adjusting those bylaws so that you can go forward with that activity. And also just having a good FAQ, put it up on your website. Those kind of things can help also the board members and your stakeholders be informed at all times throughout the crisis. Leadership, what are we looking for? What should a board be looking for in their executive team? It's a tall order, I've got to say. As I was preparing this slide, I went, wow, this is a lot to deliver on. But we're looking for executive directors or general managers to be able to balance quick action with time for thinking things through properly. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but you need to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. And for the executive directors on the webinar today, I'm sure you've been feeling that tremendous pressure of trying to find balance, perspective, and that sense of urgency, which can be really stressful. Being able to get clear and concise information from your leadership team is also key. And being prepared for the scrutiny of media and stakeholders. People can get very uptight and nervous during a time of crisis, and they want to know that everything's under control. So a good executive director should be able to handle that, and have a good temperament, and the ability to handle things under pressure is also key. So this is usually the time where we see people's true colors, and I'm hoping that most of our friends out there are able to keep it together and keep strong with all of these added responsibilities during the crisis. The advice that I have for boards during a crisis, obviously, we have to be accountable and responsible for our actions. Donors are super, super, they expect a lot nowadays. Donors are expecting transparency. They want, they know that the responsibility falls not only on the leadership team, but also on the board. So we need to be aware of that. You need to get out in front of the problems as soon as they're happening. Like I said earlier, don't hide. You've really got to get your messaging out there. And when the shit hits the fan, the public expect that the board knows what's going on. So that's why I started the conversation today with really opening up those lines of communications between the team and the board, because you don't want to be approached or contacted by media or by any stakeholder asking you a question about, how are you guys dealing with this? And the board member doesn't even know how to answer, because that puts a board member in a very difficult position, and you don't want them to be put on the spot, and you don't want them making up stuff because they don't have enough information. So that's why it's also really key to give them proper tools to communicate on behalf of the organization. And when they don't know what to say, they should be comfortable saying, so-and-so is the spokesperson at our organization about this crisis. Please feel free to reach out to them. So board members should also have that responsibility of, when they don't know the right things to say, they should point people in the right direction. And the whole thing about don't overplan, I think I should just explain this, is that, even though I've been talking about planning, there is an element about, there are some things that are just so unpredictable. And I think we're feeling it week to week through COVID, that as best as it is to have a plan, we can't always necessarily follow it. So what I mean about don't overplan is, it's important to have the processes in place, and the procedures, but the plans themselves might have to be rejigged. But just having the processes and the procedures in place is really, really the important thing to remember here. And last but not least, supporting that executive director. So we talked about how stressful the leadership team, the position of being in a leadership position is at an organization right now. Reach out to your executive team, make sure that they're hanging in there, see what you can do to support their mental health and their stress levels so that they can do their job more effectively. How can the board help? Well, when I say consider and question management, I don't mean second guess management at every turn. That's not what I meant by this. I mean to be rather to be a sounding board and be available for healthy discussions around topics that are important and the topics at hand. So it's one thing to be able to offer advice, but then you don't want to also micromanage and take over because that can undermine the executive director's role. So you have to find that healthy balance in there. Providing constructive feedback is also important so that, because you can often feel like you're in your own little bubble when you're dealing with stress. So it's important that the board members feel that they can be available to the staff and to leadership team when the times are tough. After the crisis, it's nice to think forward a little bit when we can get our heads above water. Be sure to always be congratulating your team and review with your management any learnings from the experience. Really do a good postmortem, a debrief on the situation, how the crisis was handled, and take notes for the next time, and make sure that if you didn't have a plan in place for this crisis, that you do have one in place for the next one, and that you review that plan as you do with your strategic plan every 3 to 5 years. You should be looking at that as well. Lastly, I just wanted to share a quick little reference tool for you that I discovered in the last couple of weeks. It is a fantastic tool that is available online and being updated regularly, produced by the McConnell Foundation. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need to know to help your organization get through the crisis. And because it's a Google Doc, it's updated all the time. You don't have to download anything. You can just click on all the links, and it's super, super helpful. So that's my time up for my presentation, and I'll be available very, very shortly for your questions. Thanks.